So hello everyone and welcome to another event hosted by the Cambridge Society for Economic Pluralism. CSEP is a society that is run by a dedicated group of students united by the belief that progress in the discipline of economics will be driven by an increasingly interdisciplinary approach and a pluralist platform in the 21st century. CSEP aims to enrich the understanding of economics within Cambridge, promote alternative views on conventional thought, and make the discipline more applicable to real-world problems. This is why we're beyond excited to have Dr. Jonathan Michie here today, joining us from the University of Oxford, presenting on a very relevant and interesting topic: how to fix the economy and economics. Dr. Jonathan Michie is a professor of innovation and knowledge exchange and pro-vice chancellor at the University of Oxford, where he's also president of Keller College. Before returning to Oxford in 2008, he was director of the business school at the University of Birmingham, and before that, he had the Sainsbury Chair of Management at Birkbeck College, University of London, where he was the head of the School of Management and Organizational Psychology. Previously, he was here at Cambridge, at the Judge Business School, where he was also a fellow and director of studies in economics at Robinson College, and a research associate at the Centre for Business Research. He moved to academia from Brussels, where he was also an expert to the European Commission. Dr. Michie also became chair of the UK's Universities Association for Lifelong Learning in 2020. He's the managing editor of the International Review of Applied Economics. He was joint secretary of the 2019 Centenary Commission on Adult Education, and he was an interdisciplinary panel member for management and business in the UK's Research Excellence Framework 2021 exercise. Dr. Michie is a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, on whose council he served for 6 years, and he was awarded an Order of the British Empire for services to education. Among others, his publications include An Advanced Introduction to Globalization, and with Mark Kitchen, The Political Economy of Competitiveness, Essays on Employment, Public Policy and Corporate Performance. Today's talk will last until 7:30, with 30 to 45 minutes of presentation and then plenty of time for your questions. Welcome, Dr. Michie. Thank you for joining us, and please join me in a round of applause.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I should probably qualify a lot of it, but especially the being an expert to the European Commission. I should say that was a job title, not my evaluation of my abilities. But anyway, it turned out to be a bit of a waste of time after Brexit, but there you go. So thank you all very much for this invitation. It's great to be back in Cambridge. In fact, when I first came to Cambridge initially, I was lecturer and director of studies in economics at Newnham College, just across the road there. So I was actually good friends with Mary Beard before she became famous, back in the early 1990s. So it is great to be back. And when I was here in the 1990s, with Michael Kitson, who's here from the Judge Business School and St Catherine's College, we were both on the editorial board of the Cambridge Journal of Economics in the 1990s, which then, as now, was attempting to maintain the Cambridge tradition in economics, going back to Keynes, Caldor, Joan Robinson. Joan Robinson's got a lot of nice quotes. One was that she'd never studied mathematics, so she had to think. And another was that Frank Wilkinson, who sadly passed on a few years ago. Frank Wilkinson was on the board of Cambridge Journal of Economics with Joan Robinson at the time. Well, at the time Joan Robinson was active in Cambridge. I assume everyone knows about Joan Robinson and the fact she should have had a Nobel Prize, but there you go. But Joan Robinson had written a review article for the Cambridge Journal of Economics critiquing the latest tome from one of the leading neoclassical economists of the day. And Frank said they wrote back to Joan Robinson and said they thought her review was brilliant and they would definitely publish it. And could she let them have a title for her article? So she thought it for a bit and thought, yes, shedding darkness was her summary of the neoclassical contribution to economics. And finally, before I launch in, I just would like to thank the Society for having invited me, and also for the work you do. I mean, I think it's great that you're doing these sorts of events and trying to enrich the economics curriculum. The other thing I should say at the start is do stop me, interrupt me at any time. Just put your hand up if you've got any questions any time, or if you want me to clarify something, or if you disagree with something, want me to justify it. It'd be much easier if you stop me as we go through rather than trying to remember it all at the end. So what I'm going to do is firstly talk about globalization. Secondly, the global financial crisis of now more than 10 years ago, 15 years ago, which I'll argue the form of globalization we had in the run-up was largely to blame for that disaster. And then finally go on to think about what we need to do about it in terms of economic policy and indeed improving the economics curriculum. In terms of globalization, as been said, I did write this little book, and I brought copies along in case anyone wants one. You're very welcome to buy one for £10 at the end. And basically everything I'm going to be arguing is in here, apart from what's happened since the last couple of years, but I'd say it's all pretty well predicted in there as well. So you're very, very welcome to take copies if you want. The key point I want to make about globalization is that it's not just a thing that you say you either accept or you oppose, like Tony Blair did when he argued it is just a thing, you just have to accept it, and that means you're constrained as a government. He even said it was arguing about globalization was about arguing about whether you thought autumn should come around each year. It's just literally pointless, which I think is completely misunderstand what's going on. And in order to make that point, what I say is that one does need to understand the economy, one does always have to take a historical perspective, look at where we've come from as well as what's happening now and where we're going to. So different forms of globalization have been around ever since, certainly since capitalism emerged, the sort of globalization and different forms of globalization even before that. And before the First World War, it was obviously a huge era of globalization by any measure, trade, overseas investment, and so on. And indeed, by most measures, that there was more globalization then than there had been even in the heyday of globalization over the past few decades, when a lot of people were presenting it as some sort of new development. That obviously came to an end with the First World War. Some people would say it brought its own form of globalization to an end by largely creating the First World War, the battle of the different countries, their different globalization strategies, and the division of the world for markets and so on. But certainly after the First World War, you then had a very different picture between the two world wars, with no dominant power like there had been before, and if anything, retrenchment in many countries, trying to protect industries, jobs, and so on, through reintroducing more controls on trade and so forth. And then after the Second World War, after Keynes had critiqued the disastrous outcomes agreed after the First World War with his pamphlet, the economics consequences of the peace, where he predicted that the outcome of the First World War would just lead to further difficulties and trouble, as the German economy would be constrained to recovering. And then he was obviously very active in trying to get a better deal with Bretton Woods, to get a new era of globalization, different from the interwar, but also quite different from the pre-World War I version. Keynes didn't get everything he wanted, and I think it would have been a better form of globalization after the Second World War had he done so, but he did get a lot, including very severe restrictions on financial speculation in terms of moving capital across borders, the creation of the international institutions, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, fixed currencies, and so on. And that whole era, the Bretton Woods era, from 1945 through to the mid-70s, that generation or more, that 30 years, was arguably the most successful era of capitalist development, economic growth and development there's ever been. And I'd say arguably that was largely because of that sort of architecture which had been developed and was in place. At the time it was said that this sort of artificially constrained markets, these sort of rules, regulations which had allowed that golden age of capitalism. It was termed in a famous book, Oxford University Press book about it. The critics from the 1980s onwards said it was constraining markets and, for example, the capital controls, constraining investment, and that if you remove the capital controls, there would be a sort of one-off shift to people being able to move to more profitable investment opportunities, and then things would settle down again. And of course, that proved the exact opposite of the truth. The movement of capital just created huge new markets and speculative finance, which just got greater and greater until, I'd argue, they created the 2007-2008 global financial crisis. So the global financial crisis, 2007-08, certainly was the biggest one there'd been since the 1929 Wall Street crash. And although I've gone to a minute to say the sort of Keynesian policies were taken to prevent it creating a global slump, as had happened in the 1930s, were effective. But even with those in place, there was still a global recession in 2009. Even taking the strong growth of China and other countries which continued to grow in that year. It was the first time since the 1930s that economic growth for the world as a whole was actually negative. But there was a concerted, very explicit Keynesian push to have coordinated reflation across the world, which at least minimized that recession. Huge support, obviously, to the banks who had gambled on very risky projects that they themselves had created, hoping they would win and carry on making greater and greater returns. When the gamble failed, then actually governments tended to step in and support them. They're sort of creating a one-way bet for the bankers, knowing that if they failed, they would get supported. And there were pledges for action, but I would say nothing like what was necessary to deal with the problems that had led to the global financial crisis in the first place. All that deregulation, privatization, demutualization, the generation of a sort of greed is good culture, a corporate and political culture, increased inequality of income, wealth, power, geography, space, and that those inequalities played a direct route into the global financial crisis, with particularly in America, mortgage holders not being able to pay their debts, but in general, credit and debts having been racked up by those who are struggling financially, where wages have been stagnant for a long time. And that those, as you probably know, those debts were then sort of collateralized and sold on as great new products that people had sort of invented, even though they were bad debts and therefore bad products, and it would all come crashing down and they would literally turn out to be worthless. But less talked about, I think, is a further point, a sort of pincer movement of inequality creating instability and the crash, which I think is likely to, again, unless it's addressed, where those with stagnating wages were turning to credit and debt, but the new super wealth, high net wealth individuals, they like to call themselves, with the hugely wealthy, were putting increasing pressure on banks to come up with more and more innovative products which would deliver greater and greater financial returns on these huge potential savings investments they were prepared to put in. And that really fueled this behavior of banks thinking up more and more complex products that nobody understood. I mean, you probably know they were literally hiring the best, maybe not sometimes economists, but often mathematicians or physicists from Oxford, Cambridge and elsewhere to think up these complex new products which would come with an 800-page book of explanatory detail to the people buying them. Neither the buyers or the sellers really knew what was going on, what these products were being sold, which are fueling the world economy, and certainly not the boards of directors who are in charge. The pledges for action which were made, certainly in Britain, included promoting a greater degree of corporate diversity in the financial services sector to try to get away from this too big to fail problem, and ensuring regional balance. It was recognised even 15 years ago that there were left behind regions that should be levelling up and so on. So you'd think that had all been cured 15 years ago and wouldn't be being talked about now. But sadly not. I'll comment on those two in turn. Firstly, the one about promoting corporate diversity. In 2010 there was a coalition government elected in Britain, coalition between the Liberal Democrats, Lib Dems and the Conservatives, and that government actually agreed a coalition agreement between the parties, which did commit that government, the coalition government, to promoting greater financial corporate diversity in the financial services sector, including by creating more mutual building societies. I mean, by mutual I mean in general any organisation owned by its members, either its employees like John Lewis, or its customers like building societies where people save in them and then borrow the money to buy their bank. And most people in Britain during the golden age of capitalism, when there was economic growth throughout the 1950s, 60s and into the 70s, most people in Britain saved and crucially borrowed money to buy their house, not from banks but from building societies that they owned collectively as members. And one of those was called Northern Rock. But then during the 1980s, along with the privatisation, deregulation, there was also a demutualisation where these building societies were turned into banks. And of course the economic profession by and large and its representatives argued that this would increase efficiency, banks were more efficient, it would make these companies more efficient, it would be better for these companies, even though these companies had all been very successful for generations. And in fact, as a result of this demutualisation, which caused a few people to become very rich, the advisors and those who took decisions on the boards. As a result of them, there wasn't a single building society, there was a large number, there wasn't a single building society that survived on its own as a bank. They all failed or were taken over by existing bigger banks. And this Northern Rock shot to fame globally because they managed to reinvent the bank run. You'll have read in history about the 19th century when people were first trying to set up banks and people didn't really, a bit confused about where their money was, and every time there was a rumour started, everyone would dash down to the bank and demand their money be taken out again, and so the bank would collapse, and people realised they weren't going to be able to develop an economy unless they got over this problem. So they ensured the banks had proper reserves and then publicised the fact that they had proper reserves and there was no need for people to panic every time a rumour came out. However, these demutualised building societies, the rumour did come that this Northern Rock, despite having been successful for generations, had just gambled like the other banks, and their gambles were probably going to fail and the money wouldn't be there. So sure enough, the bank run after 150 years or so was reinvented, and the people of Newcastle queued around the block to get their money out as soon as they could. And sure enough, when they got to the front of the queue, they were told that gambles had gone wrong and they'd lost all the money, and they couldn't get their money, it had gone. And this was a perfect opportunity for the coalition government to put their money where their mouth was, to actually fulfil one of the pledges they made of reintroducing mutual societies into the financial services sector to increase the degree of diversity. And this would have been very simple, and indeed I'm director of the Oxford Centre for Cooperative Mutual and Co-owned Business. And I advised at the time about how this could be remutualised, which is pretty simple. It just means that the current owners, which was actually the government taxpayers, could be nationalised, would get paid, and that would be paid over an agreed amount of time annually through the profits, the usual way that employee ownership buyout works. The government didn't do that, though, despite having just pledged to in their government coalition agreement. Instead, they sold it to Richard Branson and some New York hedge funds. And when asked in the challenge in the House of Commons as to why they'd done that, they said that they'd received no advice on how it could be remutualised, despite the fact I had actually given that advice on a bit of paper to the people who were running the organisation that had to decide, what to do with the company. So that's what happened there. I've detailed all this and lots more in Oxford Handbook of Mutual Cooperative and Co-owned business, making the case both for mutual building societies and employer ownership more generally. Now, in terms of the other part of the corporate diversity pledge of introducing corporate diversity, including by promoting mutuals, but also through other ways, that failed as well as a pledge. The government did nothing to bring that about, and they didn't even said they failed to even measure corporate diversity. They didn't even introduce a measure by which they could report to Parliament whether they were succeeded or failing. So with a colleague, Professor Christine Aiton, we did that ourselves. We created a corporate diversity index for the financial services sector, which included geographical diversity as well as ownership and other factors. And you can see that the big decline in diversity certainly did fuel the financial instability and the global financial crisis. But following the pledge by the coalition government to reverse that development, nothing was done, and it didn't. The degree of diversity hasn't increased, and we've taken it further, and it's still just as stagnant. So that was the pledge to introduce a greater degree of corporate diversity, including by reintroducing more mutuals, which the coalition government didn't do, neither. They also pledged to reduce regional imbalances, promoting better regional sharing of economic activity and wealth. Now, of course, there's been a long-term problem. Has been analysed by a number of us. A problem going back, 100 years or so, with the City of London having developed when the British Empire was operating globally, and the City of London was very much serving that purpose. Very differently from other economies like Germany and others, where the financial services sector grew up very much alongside the manufacturing plants who were needing financial services, and was very much serving that purpose rather than the global operation of the British economy. But again, this didn't materialise, and during the I think this came home to roost during the 2016 Brexit campaign, because during that campaign it was argued by all the political parties, all of whom were supporting continual membership of the European Union, that the economy had actually enjoyed an economic recovery and was doing well. I was pleased to see that you had Andy Haldane speaking here, who at the time was the chief economist at the Bank of England. And during this Brexit campaign, when these claims were being made, he said it's true if you look at the data, but he broke the British data down into regions, and it turned out to be true only for 2 regions, and in all the other regions it wasn't true. All the other regions, there had been no recovery in living standards, and it was just another example of increased inequality, which actually made matters worse. I think in the Brexit vote, not only people had stagnant wages and their towns and cities were not recovering, but they saw what was happening in the 2 regions which were doing well, and those 2 regions were London and the South East. And there's this, it's a bit out of date now, but I think it makes the point, as a graph from The Economist, which puts this well, looking at inequality between the poor and the rich in 2000, when the coalition government started, and 2015, when they finished. So you can see that at the start, Britain at the top was by far the most unequal, from the red dot to the blue dot was way worse than any other country. But 5 years later, most of the countries actually had got worse, but the only one which had got really, really worse was Britain. And of course, things are actually worse than it looks here, because they've actually had to break the line for Britain, because otherwise it would come right through here. So the inequality was a global phenomenon through that, what the Oxford economist, the late Andrew Glynn, described as capitalism unleashed from the 1980s onwards, when there was this global move to abolish exchange controls, capital controls, privatization, deregulation, and so on, which did lead to increased inequality globally. But by far the worst example was Britain. So although there was this initial global agreement for Keynesian policies to be implemented to prevent a decline into a global slump, which was feared, like in the 1930s, another Great Depression, that was relatively short-lived, particularly in Britain, where we had austerity imposed for a decade, a lost decade with public spending cuts, which I think is now coming home to roost again, which prevented the normal recovery that one would have expected from a deep recession like that. And I would argue that that situation leaves the whole global economy vulnerable for further such crises, and in particular Britain, where all these problems in most cases were worse in the first place and have been exacerbated since by government policies over the last 20 or so years. And I say, maybe think nothing could get worse, but actually the response to COVID, I think, has actually been very disappointing in this country. There was a commission, I organised a commission on creating healthy cities, on the basis that most people in the world now live in cities, when COVID broke out, which made a lot of very good recommendations about how urban areas and cities can be made healthier, both in terms of being more resilient to future pandemics, but also just in terms of people's lifestyle and well-being. But at the moment, I think we're not in a good place. So on that pessimistic note, what can be done about it? What should we do? In global terms, in general terms, I'd say we need a global Green New Deal. I mean, a sort of New Deal like America and some other countries had in the 1930s, but on a global scale, and very much tackling the climate crisis and shifting industries onto a new environmentally sustainable path. I think this cartoon nicely sums it up. Yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders, which I think is very much what was happening in that capitalism unleashed decade, which led to the global financial crisis. And I admit that's slightly pessimistic, and it's sometimes said that we are in unprecedentedly bad times at the moment with all the problems facing the economy and society globally, and particularly in Britain. But there have been difficult times before, and during the First World War, the government of the day, Lloyd George as Prime Minister, set up a ministry for reconstruction to think, how on earth do you reconstruct the economy and society after such devastation? And it's known that post-First World War governments were very disappointingly ineffectual. The best-known slogan after the First World War was "Homes fit for heroes." You know, they'd build new homes fit for the heroes who'd returned from the fighting, and that never happened. I'd say that the most impactful thing that Ministry for Reconstruction did during the First World War was set up a committee on adult education, and that published a report in 1919, just after the First World War, which argued that to recover as a society and economy, you had to have massive investment in education for the whole population, not just for students going from school to university, but for the whole population on a continual basis. And so it was a really radical report. I mean, much more radical than you hear from anyone nowadays. It was in 1919, including the fact that people, wherever they live, in whichever village or town, they should get together places like this and decide what they want to learn about, and the providers, Works Education Association, the local university, should be obliged to put on courses on topics that they wanted to learn about. Whereas now, not only has funding been cut for adult education, lifelong learning, but when governments do sort of allow it, they're always trying to interfere in terms of what can be taught and what can't, what's good for people to learn and what's not. And that 1919 report is not just very radical, but very insightful by today's standards. And interestingly, going back to what I said about looking what happened historically to understand where we are at any given time and what might happen in the future, the three main arguments they made, I think, are arguably just as important now, 100 years later, than at the time. And I say all this because to mark the centenary of that 1919 report, we set up a commission on adult education and lifelong learning to look at that, which published a report called a permanent national necessity exactly 100 years later, in November 2019. 100 years after 1919, which is good timing in terms of being exactly 100 years after the historic report. Slightly bad timing that was the middle of the general election and rather got lost in that. But it's an excellent report, and we actually launched an Adult Education 100 campaign, of which this report was one, where Mary Beard from across the road is one of the patrons, please say. But also this report, which is available free of charge, by the way. The next slide gives you the website to go to. It's all free of charge, and there's a lot more material there from activities since. And the preface to it was written by Andy Haldane, who you had here, the chief executive of chief economist of the Bank of England. The reason it's called a permanent national necessity is the 1919 report said that to recover from the First World War, economically, socially, education, including adult education and lifelong learning, had to be a permanent national necessity, not just sending some people to university age 18, but throughout our lives. And the three arguments they said, which made it so important, which I think are just as important today, they said, well, firstly, obviously there are big issues in society that everybody has to partake in, discussing, debating, so everybody has to have a degree of education, knowledge, and the ability to learn and even discuss, debate. Obviously they were thinking about trying to avoid more world wars, but now we've got those same problems, but also unfortunately the climate crisis as well. So certainly those arguments, I think, are as strong as ever. Secondly, they said there was new technologies on the horizon, and so it was literally useless to just train today's workers and today's skills. What you needed is a workforce which had the capabilities and capacity to deal with new technologies as they emerged and were introduced, and to make the best use of those. And then thirdly, this was at the time when the electorate was being extended, the vote was being given to many more people, with the aim of giving it to all adults in society. And so they said, in that case, it becomes vitally important that everyone in society is educated, so they know about the issues, but also so they can think critically and have the ability to weigh up evidence. And this is in their words more than 100 years ago, rather than me saying it today because of today's news. They said so that people could distinguish the difference between genuine political arguments on the one hand and demagoguery on the other. So I think those reasons are just as important today. And it's the website where you can get that report free of charge, both to read on the web or download. So step back and conclude about a global Green New Deal, what needs to be in it. I think the key point is that it's got to be globalization for a purpose, not just accepted as inevitable for some mystical reason or because of technology or anything else, because that's just not true. It's very much up to political actors, governments, companies and others to decide the degree and type and nature of globalization. So it should be globalization for a purpose. And today that has to be to promote environmental and social sustainability, globally as well as locally and everywhere in between. And that's got to be combined with corporate purpose, with proper corporate behaviours, which we unfortunately don't always see. And I would argue where you have at least part of the ownership in the hands of local communities or customers or employees, that tends to be a force for good in terms of those companies having a corporate purpose and behaving in a way which promotes social sustainability and usually environmental sustainability as well. And that requires all the long-term thinking and actions, investment, long-term investments in skills and capabilities and so on, which again Britain has been notoriously bad at. I think well illustrated in this cartoon here, with decision making by a British board of directors where Dogbert, the consultant, tells them their profits are plunging, they've got to do something about it. But he said it's not going to be easy because the brains of your competitors are large, and beavers are pretty small, and your brains are even smaller. And so the board of directors say, so what should we do? Cut the training budget again? And that is literally what tends to happen in British companies, often when it's most inappropriate, and we need long-term growth. And this consistency over time has been long argued by economists, the need to take long horizons, but unfortunately not always, I'd say, in orthodox economics, and not in by policy makers either. To be fair, they're often looking at the next general election, but for policy, do need, some countries do, 5, 10, 20 year strategies behind them. Again, Joan Roberts actually stressed the importance of time, and that was one of her criticisms of economics, that it didn't take proper amount of time. And she's famously quoted saying that time is what keeps everything from happening at the same time, to which someone said, and she probably thinks space is what stops everything from happening in Cambridge. But she would actually agree that economics is lacking a proper appreciation of space as well as time. Those were things that she thought should be reintroduced. I'll stop there because, as I say, I've put all this in the book, and actually in greater detail it's argued in a book which goes through economic policy, which is actually written jointly with Michael Kitson here, which goes through economic policy arguments across the board, but also, and that's in terms of what needs to be done about the economy, it also addresses what should be done about economics. In the introduction we go through the sorts of arguments I've been making and that have been made in the Cambridge Journal of Economics about how to make economics more realistic and impactful. So in conclusion, I'll just say one more thing, which is some of you will know that a few years ago, to show off their brilliance, the economists at the London School of Economics invited the Queen round to look at a display of all the great work she was doing, and she famously said, "Oh, very, very interesting, yes, but why didn't you foresee the financial crisis?" And there was embarrassed silence in the room, and she went back to Buckingham Palace, and it was several days before they managed to come up with the answer. It's a 3-page letter which I won't read to you in all because it's not worth it, to be honest. But there's one or two interesting things where they say the difficulty was seeing the risk to the system as a whole rather than to any specific financial instruments or loans. Risk calculations were most often confined to slices of financial activity using some of the best mathematical minds, but they frequently lost sight of the bigger picture. It's absolutely right, but then you think, and what are you doing about it? Those of us who think that the bigger picture should be taught and borne in mind whenever policy is discussed. And so similarly, they say, in summary, it was principally a failure of the collective imagination of many bright people, and they were talking about themselves here, of many bright people to understand the risk to the system as a whole. So I would argue that we should think more imaginatively, more systemically, and more ambitiously. And so to your organisation, I would say keep up the good work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Michie, for an amazing and very insightful talk. And now let's open the floor to any questions that you might have, because certainly this did prompt a lot of questions. Would anyone like to start off?
And just while I think, I just put that up there just in case anyone comes up with a question later on. Do feel free to email me at any time. But don't let me stop you coming in now.
What would your primary advice to policymakers be on how to reduce regional inequality?
It's a very good question, because the trouble is it does need everything. You need to do everything, and you need to do it for a long time. But I don't know if you saw a couple of days ago, Andy Burnham, the regional mayor up in Manchester, and one or two other of the regional mayors had a conference in which they got government to come up to, and they argued that you should do what Germany's done, which is have it in the constitution, that it's not just a slogan at an election, it's actually a constitutional requirement to ensure that there aren't too great disparities between regions, and to work actively to try and reduce inequalities, whereas there's no requirement here. So that's one thing, but the fundamentals are investing in the sort of productive infrastructure, transport, housing, the other utilities and so on, which, as you know, is huge, is very costly. But on the other hand, most of those costs are going to the people who live in the area who are actually involved in those activities, particularly if it can be combined with an industrial strategy and so on, which is forward-looking. So they've anticipated what sorts of companies and firms are needed in that area in order to make a success of the 10, 20, 30 year plan. So it is everything but long-term thinking, and long-term resources are vital. Yeah.
To expand on that, how can that be done for more remote regions? So the absolute north of Scotland, it will be really hard to encompass it or include it in the general economic activity in the UK. No, that's a good point. So I think that just has to be borne in mind. I read an article just a couple of days ago, though, which was quite interesting in terms of Scotland, because England banned. I mean, in my day, we were always told that renewable energy could never produce more than 5% or 10% of Britain's energy needs. Now wind energy alone is producing 25% or more. But England have banned wind farms in England. They have to either be in the sea or in Scotland. So actually, a huge proportion of that 25% of our energy, and I say ours is basically, Oxford, Cambridge, London, the southeast, is being generated in Scotland and having to be shipped down through pipelines to the south. And there's two interesting things. A, they haven't invested enough in the infrastructure, so they actually can't get all enough electricity down, even though it's being generated in Scotland. So they actually have to pay the Scottish operators to stop the wind farms, to not produce any, and then they've got to pay gas power stations down in the south to produce more energy down here and destroy the environment in order to make up for the electricity Scotland's happy to provide, but they don't have the infrastructure to bring it down. Now, part of the reason I say that is an obvious solution, which is used elsewhere, is to incorporate pricing in it. Because it's all sold at the same price, even though it's very expensive to then take the energy from Scotland all the way down. If Scotland was paid more, and that paid for some of the infrastructure, then actually that alone might sort of rebalance things. And that's one example. It's quite a big one. But more fundamentally, it's just making sure that well, A, there's the infrastructure, across the whole country, but B, when decisions are being made about, where companies are being developed and so on, that those factors are borne in mind as well. I think it can be done.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
In terms of pushing forward innovation and tackling big picture productivity decline, do you think that there's an inefficient, allocation of people and young graduates going into not the best sectors to be addressing those problems?
Not necessarily. I think that the bigger issue is not having the investment so that people have the confidence that there are going to be markets for these things in 5, 10 years and so on. Which, going back to the example of wind farms, was why there was such a small percentage of the British sector was being created from renewables. There was no certainty that prices would be paid over the next 5, 10 years to justify sort of long-term investments. Once that was done, there's then been huge amounts of innovation in that sector. So I think it's in Britain, it's been the short-termism is a problem, as well as sometimes, don't want to exaggerate this, but sometimes those who've already got a good market position, and I just give one example of that, just because it's sort of quite striking, which is Britain was in the forefront of computing, artificial intelligence, robotics in the 1960s. There were arguably two intelligent robots developed in the 1960s, one in Stanford in America and one in Edinburgh, University of Edinburgh. And the engineer who actually built that robot, a guy called Stephen Salter, he must have been quite young then, because he's still around today. And in fact, he was at COP26 in Glasgow, because this push for sort of geoengineering contributions, I wouldn't say sort of contributions to climate change. Are there any ways we can use geoengineering? He's got quite an interesting scheme, which, unlike a lot of them, some of them is well, you should go up to build power stations in space and so on. Trouble is, it's very risky. You use a lot of energy doing it, and carbon and so on. His one was quite interesting, because it just uses barges in the sea, fueled entirely by solar panels, which use solar panels just to spray the salt water up into the clouds to thicken them, so more of the sunlight is deflected back into space. And particularly if you do that around the Arctic caps, would stop the melting and so on. But also, in the early 1970s, he came up with the idea, which was called Salter's ducks, or Edinburgh ducks, which is in the North Sea. Just put all these sort of bobbing ducks, and they would just generate electricity, 24/7. And they were doing experiments on that, and he argued it looked like it was very doable, particularly if you look at the degree to which the cost of wind farms or solar energy has come down massively, by orders of magnitude once you start developing it. But those experiments, well, it was officially the funding was stopped by government under Nigel Lawson in the 1980s, when it was said had to do belt tightening. So another example of short-termism. But even before then, an order had come to stop the experiments, and that order had come from the nuclear industry. It was a board which they controlled, and they stopped that generation of alternative power. So I think the thing about people going to different sectors, I mean, I would tend to think, I think the more important are these long-term, incentives and structures and so on, so that companies or people creating companies or growing companies got the confidence that these sectors, these innovations are going to be profitable. And I think then people tend to, be flexible provided they're given opportunities for education and training and retraining and so on, and can easily adapt to what's needed, both individually and as a collective. But the education does need to be available.
So the Green New Deal you talked about in your presentation really sounded amazing. However, I am curious, how do you think like companies could be made to consider longer term impact and environmental impact more in practice?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, because it's not difficult to get them to say that they will do. But as you obviously know, there's a lot of greenwashing going on and not putting their money where their mouth is. But I think there are a lot of things you can do. I mean, one is what I've been talking about. You know, if you really put long-term policies in place and can be trusted, you know, as a government to stick to long-term policies, so that, you know, you're if you invest in wind farms, you know, you will get paybacks over 10, 15, 20 years. I think, you know, that's very important. There's a initiative which I think is also very important and could play a big role, which was launched as GFANS, where the G was for Glasgow, because it was launched at COP26 in Glasgow, which is the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which is headed up by Mark Carney, you know, who was the Governor of the Bank of Canada and then Governor of the Bank of England, and he's now United Nations Special Envoy on climate change. He's heading that up, and what they're attempting to do is get all the world's financiers, or as big a proportion as possible, you know, banks, sovereign wealth funds, you know, other prices of finance, to agree not to finance any company unless that company has a proper net zero strategy. And it doesn't mean that, you know, they wouldn't fund, you know, current oil companies, or, you know, companies which have got bad record, provided they have a genuine strategy, which I'm told by those who know that some of the oil companies do, and some say they do, and not so much in practice. So I think that could, you know, if that's successful, they have got a large proportion. I mean, I think something like a third or something of the world's financial institutions signed up to that. So I think that could be quite impactful. But these things are always a continual struggle, and always come down to politics as well. Like I said, with the nuclear industry killing off the renewable energies back in the early 70s, because there's been you may know, big lawsuits launched in America to try to rule this illegal, this sort of pro-green policies illegal, because you shouldn't be allowed to discriminate against, you know, companies that don't have a net zero strategy, which is complete misuse of the legal system. They're using laws which were never set up, you know, supposed to be antitrust and laws to help consumers, but there are these continual battles still going on. But I think both things, you know, governments having long-term industrial policies and the financial thing could be key.
And on a follow-up to that, we've seen, for example, COP27 has been largely a disappointment, and over 600 companies were invited to actually participate, like oil companies. How would you suggest that a Green New Deal would be constructed, especially taking into account the fact that globalization means that a country that imposes efficiency standards or a carbon tax would just move its production to another country who doesn't sort of respect environmental regulations? How do you factor that into, make all countries to sort of join an agreement to tackle climate change?
Yeah, well, I think always as the global, local and national in between, you just always have to, you know, do what you can at all levels. Try and get global agreements for carbon tax and all the rest of it, but also, you know, do what you can locally and nationally. And often they will have quite strong demonstration effects. You know, some local areas or some countries seem to be doing well by getting a lead in green technologies, then others may follow suit. And even on about taxation, which is one of the more difficult ones, we think, you know, if one country does just make themselves much more attractive. Interestingly, at the moment, the biggest example of that sort of thing happening is actually America, which is actually promoting green technologies and people are complaining because, you know, good companies then moving to America because they've got good policies. So hopefully that will provoke the European Union and others to do likewise.
Thank you.
I've got a question about, have you heard of the One Road initiative? So what would be your thoughts on this in terms of globalization in the future and economic development? with countries around the world that are taking help?
In what way? Do you mean?
Called the One Belt,
Yeah.
One Road Initiative, yeah.
I mean, so China basically
Yeah.
making trade easier with other countries. I mean, I guess the extent that it's railways being put down and so on, and that's better than having aircraft. Yeah, it's. I'm not sure it'll have much impact on that. I mean, obviously it's good for China, which is why they're doing it. It's good for those countries who are linking up, which includes Italy, but not some other countries. So, I'm not sure by itself it'll have a huge difference. I think it's more just about China trying to get more secure trading partners, and it works the other way as well. China, is a very complex country with a lot of different good and bad things going on. But the amount of green technology they're investing in and producing is just phenomenal. Puts Europe and America to shame, actually, the amount of new renewable energy they're introducing, despite the fact they're still obviously relying on coal and so on, because they are still got economic growth despite all their problems.
So you have talked about lacking economic productivity growth in the UK after the 2008 crisis. However, if I remember correctly the data, it has been the case in most advanced countries that productivity and economic growth in general has been much lower. Why do you think that has happened? Because you have discussed the UK, but not really like other countries overall.
Yes, it is a good question. Partly I think it may have been because that whole era, what Andrew Glynn called capitalism unleashed, reached its sort of ultimate inevitable conclusion of disaster and collapse. And so at the time, actually it was thought, I think that was more actually quite recognised. It was sort of assumed that unless something really dramatic was done, like in the 1930s, that actually there wasn't any clear path for recovery. Things would just carry on having collapsed until some new model was introduced. And the trouble is that that generally hasn't been. Funny enough, in some countries the renewable energy and the green technologies have given a bit of a boost. But I think that's partly it. That old model collapsed. I hate to say I told you so, but a lot of people were saying it from beginning. Andrew Glynn most obviously, and there hasn't been a new model developed to replace that, which I think is needed.
Just a follow up to that. Do you think, what do you think when a new such model will be developed, if ever?
Well, I think the climate crisis certainly needs it, because that does seem to be now, genuinely, recognised, and I think along with environmental sustainability. I think even globally, it's generally recognised there's got to be a degree of social sustainability as well. That you can't have this increased inequality is quite damaging. And actually, one thing I haven't mentioned is the tax evasion, tax dodging, which really is actually at massive, significant scale globally. In the past you might think, well, it was just a few bad apples, but now it's a huge industry and hugely damaging to the global economy, individual countries, and I think whole society. Just the chair of the Conservative Party just lost their job. Yes, and I think there's Financial Times and others arguing that's not, is not unrelated. There's this whole ethos of greed is good, and if you can avoid taxes, it shows you're cleverer than other people, etc. That just has imbued society. So actually, I think it does need a whole sort of societal shift as well as a new sort of economic paradigm for the next generation, which around green technologies and so are obvious, but it does need all that tax the greed is good culture to be challenged with the ending of tax evasion, tax avoidance. And it's so ironic as well that it's at a time when there isn't any big taxation on the rich. You know, I mean, it used to be in the golden age of capitalism. You know, the rich would be taxed, you know, 70%, 80%, 98% on unearned income, and it was just sort of regarded as natural. You know, because once you get to that level of income, why would you need any more? It was a sort of general feeling in most societies. Whereas now, you know, those levels of taxation have gone down, and yet they're doing more tax evasion and avoidance than they were when they were actually getting taxed. So I think there is a lot to be done, but obviously it's you know, a lot that can be done and should be done, and quite possibly will be done. But there are obviously big forces at work to try and prevent it.
I think in light of the recent kind of interest in the welfare, everyday or foundation economy approaches, do you think it's feasible in addressing regional inequalities, and when it comes to implementing these kind of alternative theories in the UK, do you think it's actually feasible?
Sorry, what's feasible? I didn't catch your beginning.
Welfare, like the everyday economy or foundational economy approaches, non-traditional kind of economic thinking. Yeah, I do. I mean, certainly, I think it would be a very good, important, and positive part of a new era of development. If that was, you know, then how people just assume their local communities would be operating and so on. And I think it ties in with a bigger picture about sustainability, social and environmental sustainability. I mean, the difficulty is sort of getting from here to there. So it does need some real sort of political leadership, you know, beyond, unfortunately, just, you know, the sound bites and so on, which are just getting people, you know, disillusioned. Yeah, but I think you know, I think most people in most societies would welcome that sort of shift. It's just a question of how to bring it about.
So how would you tackle the issue of, in most developed countries, political leadership changing every 3 to 4 years or maybe a bit longer, and how policy can be made resilient to these changes where political agenda completely changes and the funding for certain projects might be cut, might be increased. And as you say, even if it is written into the constitution, is it reasonable to say that a part of maybe society can hold the government accountable for this and maybe take them to court for not committing to or not meeting their agenda? Is that reasonable to say?
Yeah, well, very good question, but very complex as well. Because I think fundamentally it is about, you know, you and me and everyone else, you know, believing in it and, you know, and holding, you know, people to account. And so it does go back to what I was talking about before about the culture, about having a completely different culture of expecting everybody to behave properly and, you know, being everyone knowing if someone doesn't behave properly that, you know, they will be sort of pariahs. And, you know, it might sound a bit sort of, you know, naive and idealistic, but actually I think that is how most societies and companies and organizations, you know, do operate to different degrees. And, you know, some operate quite well and most people wouldn't behave badly, and if they do, then they would be seen as a pariah and would be got rid of, or, you know, or dealt with. Other examples you can think of where it's all gone terribly wrong and so something drastic has to be done. So I think it does come down fundamentally to culture, but I think there are structural things as well. So, for example, in Britain, you know, during the 1950s and 60s, during the golden age of capitalism, there was a succession of, you know, Conservative or Labour governments, but they were all completely committed to, you know, universal healthcare, universal education, even building, you know, hundreds of thousands of council flats and houses so that nobody would be owned, everyone could have a council house or flat at reasonably low rents. There was just no disagreement. They just competed with each other at election about who would, you know, provide more. So first, I think if you know, this thing can breed on success, and the trouble is we're currently, I think, in the, you know, the other end of that spectrum of, you know, competing on sound bites. But also goes back to some of the other questions in terms of structure of the economy. And Britain is a very sort of top-down, decentralised
country. I think if you've got more power in regions and localities, which we used to have a bit more, I mean, Britain's got worse. You've got more power in localities and regions and so on, then that acts as a buffer, when governments change, regions won't be at the same time. So I think it's a combination of, sort of people power and education and culture on the one hand, and the structural things which could and should be done as well.
A question I have then. You mentioned how in 2007-8 financial crisis there were a lot of complex instruments and derivatives that sort of led to people not being able to understand how related they are in the collective risk in the economy. Do you think these concerns have been sufficiently addressed to prevent the next crisis? And if not, is that because of lobbying, let's say, from all these people who are profiting from all these instruments, or is it because the government's not being serious enough about these issues?
Yes, good question again. I think there has been some things done, to be fair to governments and central banks, but not nearly enough. So I think largely it is the same picture of exactly the wrong culture. A lot of these organisations where it is just making money for the sake of making money, and if you can sell stuff for more. I mean, Goldman Sachs has been in the news a bit recently, but after the global financial crisis, as you know, there was then the sovereign wealth difficulties in the European Union and Greece most dramatically. But there, Goldman Sachs had taken a huge 600 million euros. I think they got paid in order to sort of restructure the government's book so that it looked like they were more sustainable according to the Maastricht criteria and so on. And then at the time, once it was clear that the Greek economy wasn't going well, Goldman Sachs then bet against them and made more money, betting against their currency, even though they knew the currency was going down because they knew the books had been cooked because they'd cooked them. So you got this sort of corporate culture with the whole ethos of sort of deal making can be pretty bad. I mean, the problem then is, well, how do you get, is that sector, salvageable? But it certainly wasn't as bad as that, previously. Even in the, banking, financial sector, there was believed to be a sort of a purpose, corporate purpose, was to invest, to lend to genuine economic enterprises who had a purpose and would, deliver that purpose, making a profit at the same time, and then repay the loan. So, I think we can get back to more of that sort of corporate purpose and better corporate culture. But it's got to be seen as part of the bigger picture as well, the societal culture and government regulation and so on. And at the same point, government could and should have done more, and still could, in terms of, having the building societies back in mutual ownership, owned by the local residents who are lending the money to the organisation, then borrowing it to build their houses, rather than having that done from a hedge fund in New York.
Thank you.
And I suppose actually that slightly links up to the welfare sort of top point. I mean, the more that activities can be, localised, I think that does help the cultural point, which used to happen. People in Britain, they all had the name. They were all called the Halifax or the Coventry Building Society or whatever. So everyone knew the manager because they were a local person and their kids went to the same school, etc. So it's quite different from being a hedge fund in another country. Or you probably don't know which country it's in because they'll be in some tax haven.
Aside from underinvestment, I think there are strong economic incentives to enter more speculative sectors like banking, as you mentioned. So I was wondering whether you have any specific policies you think the government should implement in terms of regulation of the financial sector, and how could the government do that in a way that doesn't too badly affect the finance sector's competitiveness vis-a-vis other rival economies?
Well, first, I think they should push for regulation at a global level, to deal with that, last point. It's, frustrating and ironic that,
one always hears this argument in Britain, oh, we can't do everything because, you know, then other people sort of undercut us, when all the evidence is it's the other countries who are trying to do good things, and we're all the ones who are always trying to, you know, undercut them. You know, so I think if Britain was more, you know, on side, you know, when Biden suggested having a general corporate tax, you know, globally and so on, then it'd be much easier. I mean, obviously, if we're still in the EU, that might be easier. But basically nowadays, you know, if the EU and America, you know, agree something, and if they get the Chinese to agree as well, then, you know, it's pretty well you can implement it, because, you know, there are companies who operate in Britain. You know, they do have a lot of protection under British law. So, you know, you owe them money, you have to pay them back. If Britain could say, if they introduce these things, well, if you do leave, then, well, you've left and you're no longer covered by British law. So if you owe them money, you wouldn't have to pay them back. So they've got a lot to lose as well. Of course, they bargain. But I think you do need to pursue these sort of policies and try and get international agreement. But if not, do it anyway, because really how attractive your country is for these companies to operate in depends on how successful the economy is, depends on how much you're investing in it, including on health and having good infrastructure and not having regional inequalities and so on. If you could create a good and successful economy and society, then, you know, companies will want to operate there, and if they don't, others will be created.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
How much do you think recent sort of geopolitical tensions and trade tensions, so like reducing reliance on Russian energy or China, US, technological decoupling, how much of that has impacted the international cooperation needed to respond to things like climate change or sort of more coordinated global recession responses?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I mean, obviously it's been sort of disruptive. On the other hand, there's been a lot of, you know, solidarity, you know, among, like, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, obviously, and those supporting Ukraine. So I think it's, you know, on balance, you know, not great. I think not greatly. I think it's always hard to know, you know, what would have happened in the absence of it. But I think the really frustrating thing about that particular case with the Russian gas and the rest of it is that wasn't taken advantage of by our government, American government and so on, to have this huge sort of generational shift. Because one problem with economics is they will talk about things at the margin, but actually the way the world has worked historically, it's through, you know, big shifts. You know, suddenly people get paid holidays, for example, which had never been thought of before. You know, big shifts. Like happened with the golden age of capitalism, in Britain, you know, the creation of the health service, the nationalisation of the basic infrastructure, and so on, and globally with the new institutions and capital speculation not being like, you know, et cetera, et cetera. You know, these are massive shifts, and with the Russian gas thing, given that the British and other governments had all signed up to net zero, we were going to eliminate all carbon for our economy, that was the time when we could have said, okay, this is a global crisis, we've got to stop consuming, you know, fossil fuel or gas, because it's no longer being supplied, and it's a positive benefit because we can actually save the world, you know, for future generations. And just because you saw when COVID came in, I mean, government just sort of banned everything, which people didn't know they had the right to do, but they did, and no one said it was. I mean, there they could have just said, okay, gas is available, so everything's banned. If workplace can't be heated, then people have to work from home. You know, private cars could be banned, people go by public transport, that could all be made free, you know, et cetera, et cetera. You know, it could have some really, you know, huge step, which would have actually allowed us to meet the you know, COP26, COP27, you know, targets we say we will, but at the moment we're just not on track.
So you have mentioned the golden age of capitalism multiple times throughout your presentation. And if everything was so great during this period, I am just wondering, why did it end? Like, was there a fundamental problem with that economic system? Or was it just an unfortunate set of circumstances, such as the oil crisis, that caused it to end?
Well, a bit of both. I mean, I guess, you know, historically there's never been a sort of era, which goes on for more than 30 years or so. I mean, no doubt there were tensions, arising, which probably did need a different model. So I mean, you're right. So there were, and there was an active debate in the 1970s, 80s about what to do about the fact it was coming apart at the seams. The America no longer being the dominant currency, which had sort of underpinned it, and like I say, the oil shocks and so on. So in Sweden, there was the idea of going further and have wage owner funds in companies, so that part of the profits would go to buying shares to employees, and take the sort of Swedish model further down that route, which was arguments in Britain as well. Labour Party had an alternative economic strategy which had similar sorts of ideas, including maintaining capital controls and the like. So I think it was the election of Margaret Thatcher in Britain and Ronald Reagan in America gave a big boost to that the capitalism unleashed era, and then obviously the collapse of the Soviet Union, Eastern European countries gave a further boost to the global privatizations and so on. So you can see sort of how it unraveled, and obviously it's very difficult to put anything back together like that. So I think now we do need to look forward along all the ideas people have been coming up with or commenting on to create a quite new model for the next 30, 40 years. But I think just stumbling along with the current ones isn't the best option.
We have time for one more question if anyone has any lingering questions they want to ask. If not, thank you very much. Professor Michie, it was an honor having the opportunity to discuss with you. And another round of applause.